Alrighty, guys, let's take a look now at some Federalist fiascos by looking at the presidential administration of John Adams. This is Professor Tatum here to get you through this next lecture for History 1301. So buckle up and hold on tight, because here we go. We'll look at a little bit of context as always, then we'll look at some foreign affairs and domestic disturbances, and we'll examine the presidential election of 1800 and take a look at how the Federalists tried to maintain influence within the national government despite not doing so hot in that election, and how that kind of produces this concept of judicial review. Few things we need to remember jumping into this lecture. Remember, Jay's Treaty was this treaty between the U.S. and Britain, in which Britain kind of agreed to do a lot of things that they should have been doing all along. They agreed to get all their troops and forts out of the U.S. They agreed to stop harassing U.S. ships and U.S. sailors. And in exchange, the U.S. was expected to give up trade rights in the Caribbean for the British to be doing these things that they should have already been doing. And this treaty was so stupid that other countries started to assume that the U.S. and Britain must have had some kind of secret negotiation that they had not made public when they met to make this treaty. Okay, so remember, we saw Spain, for example, as a result, negotiated Pinckney's Treaty with the U.S., where they settled the border dispute with Florida and gave the U.S. access to New Orleans. Well, we need to keep this in mind. We're not done seeing what all the impacts are of other nations making assumptions about Jay's Treaty. And by the way, of course, there was no secret agreement. The treaty was just this dumb. So when George Washington left office, remember how I told you about how he left office after the second term, putting a self-imposed check on his power. He didn't want to keep running for president for life. He retired after his second term. This set a tradition for other presidents to follow moving forward. Now, of course, we even have a constitutional amendment saying that presidents can only serve 2 terms. And that precedent, again, was set here by Washington in the very first presidency. And on his way out the door, George Washington, in his farewell address, gave the nation 3 warnings. He avoided us to avoid foreign alliances, particularly with European nations, because they were most prominent at this point. But really, he's just fearful in general of foreign alliances and the U.S. getting too involved in foreign affairs. And by that standard, he asked the U.S. to maintain neutrality in foreign conflicts. He also asked the U.S. to beware of factionalism and political partisanship, suggesting that the U.S. may, as a result of getting too involved in factionalism and partisanship, begin to demonstrate more loyalty to a particular political party rather than to the nation as a whole. Now, we certainly have learned from our history. We have progressed past this humble time to this moment of greatness that we all now live in, right? And we've learned so much from our history and developed past these simpletons of the past that we have not failed to follow all these warnings that Washington gave us, right? We are certainly not struggling from refusing to abide by any of these. Now, how are we? I say all that very sarcastically, unfortunately. All right, but once Washington was out, the next president elected was John Adams. Remember, John Adams is a prominent member of the Federalist Party, so that's going to impact his presidency and the policies that he passes. Another thing we need to keep in mind as we're getting into Adams' presidency is that France was going through a revolution, all right? And I'm going to give you a very complex overview here of the French Revolution, and I hope you can follow it. Do your best. It's really going to get all over the place. It's going to be the most extensive overview of the French Revolution ever presented in a history class probably. So here goes. There was a monarchy in France, and then some people got their heads cut off. Then there was a republic for a while. And then more heads got cut off. And then there was an empire under Napoleon Bonaparte. That is the French Revolution in a nutshell, guys. We don't really need to look too much more into it than that. If you're curious about it, it's a pretty fascinating topic. There's all kinds of source material on it online and elsewhere. If you're interested, I have a colleague who's very interested in all this. He's done all kinds of studies, so I can certainly get some sources sent your way if you're interested. Just let me know. But for our class, this is all I care that we understand about the French Revolution. But there's going to be some trouble with France as Adams takes office. So we need to remember that in response to the French Revolution, I had suggested before that Britain declared war on France because they didn't want these revolutionary ideas to go spreading throughout Europe, and they decided to instill order by declaring war on the revolutionaries in France to set an example to the rest of Europe that this is what happens if you revolt, all right? And I do want us to understand a little side note also that It's a result of this war with France and Britain that we get this idea that Napoleon was short, right? There's that term Napoleon complex to refer to a short person who feels like they need to overcompensate for being short. Um, Napoleon was actually average height for his time. Records show us. And it's really British propaganda against Napoleon that kind of started to present this idea of him being short or small in stature. Little side note, just kind of interesting. I love to turn our ideas of history on its head. Right, but what does any of this have to do with the U.S.? Why am I sitting here talking about the French Revolution, wars with Britain and France? Well, this is all going to impact the U.S. in different ways, all right? So the U.S. was going to try to remain neutral, but certain issues were going to get them involved in one side or the other of the conflict, okay? So Jay's Treaty, for example, had led France to believe, just like Spain had, that the U.S. must have made some kind of secret deal with Britain under the table, all right? And there must be some kind of secret partnership between the U.S. and Britain now. And France was pretty pissed at the U.S. for conspiring with Britain. They said, come on, guys, we had a treaty of alliance. We helped y'all out during your revolution. Now you're going and supporting our enemies behind our back? And in exchange for this, France started kind of stopping some U.S. ships. In some cases, they'd attack U.S. ships, but they would stop them and they would rob them, okay? And they would take all their cargo. And in some cases, they would even impress their sailors and force them to join their crews. And in response, President Adams said, well, we don't want to go to war with France over this, but we can't just tolerate this. So he sanctioned for U.S. ships to go do the same thing, all right? He said, you guys, if y'all ever see any French ships out at sea, you can go ahead and stop their ships. If you need to fire on their ships, fire on their ships. And you're welcome to steal any cargo they have, okay? So basically what we got here is this quasi-war, okay, meaning a semi-war between France and the U.S., where they're both practicing piracy against each other, and this is state-sanctioned piracy, okay? Both of their governments are approving of this. So they're not directly at war, but they're really causing each other some problems here. These troubles with France would also lead to some political troubles here in the U.S. As tensions were escalating with France, there was this mass hysteria and fear that there might be some kind of internal subversion of the French, all right? They might have some spies trying to commit espionage. There might be people there in the U.S. Who are trying to sabotage the U.S. from within. And remember the foreign alliances who each of the political parties aligned with. Okay, the Democratic Republicans had traditionally supported France, right? And they were in favor of this French Revolution. They kind of supported France in the revolution. Whereas the Federalists had supported Britain, all right? So now they're kind of torn between who to support in this conflict. And the Democratic Republicans are pretty upset with the Federalists for sanctioning piracy of French ships and causing tensions with France. And the Federalists are considering the Democratic Republicans traitors for supporting France. This is really just causing a lot of political tension in the U.S. In response to this political tension, President Adams' administration passed what was known as the Alien Act and the Sedition Act. Okay, so the Alien Act allowed the U.S. government to go and round up and deport any immigrants suspected of not supporting the U.S. Boy, that sounds familiar. Once again, we've certainly learned from our history, haven't we? Now, there was an excuse for this. Okay, this was aimed in theory at targeting French spies, but really it targeted immigrants of all diverse backgrounds. Okay, anybody who was suspected of being a potential threat to the U.S. Again, this sounds very familiar, doesn't it? But the justification here is that there might be French spies within the U.S., and they take advantage of that mass hysteria and use that to justify what they're doing. So in addition to these alien acts that allow this rounding up of foreign nationals within the U.S., the Sedition Acts made it illegal for citizens to criticize the federal government. There could not be any written or spoken criticism of the federal government. Now, this is a pretty blatant violation of the First Amendment, right? Under the First Amendment, people have freedom of speech. Furthermore, we'll see that people who were frequently targeted under this act were journalists, which also violates the freedom of the press granted by the First Amendment. Now, it's pretty fascinating. If you read the Sedition Acts, it protects pretty much all bodies of the federal government, okay? The legislature, the president, the national courts. But there's one government position, one federal office that is not specified here in the Sedition Act. So one particular position of government is not protected, and that's the vice president. The reason for that is we need to understand the stupidity of how elections worked in the early republic, okay? The way elections worked in the early republic was whoever got the most votes for president, as long as they had enough votes, would become the president. And the person with the second most votes would become their vice president. All right. So if you have rival political candidates from different parties with different ideas going head to head against each other, it's very likely that the winner and the second place winner who becomes their vice president are not going to be on the same side of things. And that's exactly what happened here under Adams's administration. Okay. So Adams, a Federalist, became president, but the second place candidate was Thomas Jefferson, who was, of course, the head of the Democratic Republican Party. So what we have here under Adams' administration is a Federalist president and a vice president who isn't a Democratic Republican. And so very conveniently, Thomas Jefferson, the Democratic Republican vice president, is not protected under the Sedition Act. Okay, so you can say all the ugly things you want about him, but not against any other member of the federal government, or you might be arrested or fined. This is all just completely absurd, okay? And as you might imagine, there was significant opposition to the Alien and Sedition Acts. One congressman who spoke out pretty heavily against these acts and against a lot of Federalist policies, really, was a congressman named Matthew Lyon, who was a Democratic Republican from Vermont. So I want to give us a little context on Matthew Lyon just to understand him a little more. This will also help us understand the broader political conflicts occurring in this period, okay? So what we're looking at here first isn't directly related to the Alien and Sedition Acts, but we'll see how it kind of ties into them, okay? So a little context on Matthew Lyon. He had some long-standing beef with a congressman named Roger Griswold, and they had multiple altercations on the floor of Congress, okay? So one day, Roger Griswold was not only politically but personally insulting Matthew Lyon on the floor of Congress, basically mocking some things that had happened with him during the American Revolution, mocking his honor and his status as a man. And Matthew Lyon did the kind of reasonable thing, and he spit at Roger Griswold. Now, some accounts say tobacco went running down his face. Other accounts say spit. But I think we're kind of splitting hairs and we're trying to figure out what got spit at this guy, whether it's saliva or tobacco. The man got spit on. Not saying he didn't deserve it. He very clearly did. But we had a congressman spitting on another congressman on the floor of Congress. All right. Matthew Lyon kind of apologized for that. He cleared things up. Him and Griswold kind of said, okay, we'll keep going from here. No big deal. I hate you, but let's let this go. And he didn't really face any charges for spitting on another congressman. All right. Then a little later down the road, Matthew Lyon was on the floor of Congress giving a speech about his discontent with some Federalist policies and how the Federalists he felt had betrayed the common American. And here comes Roger Griswold with this big hickory cane and started beating the crap out of Matthew Lyon on the floor of Congress. So Matthew Lyon ran over to the fire and grabbed a pair of fire tongs and started fighting back. And these two guys would chase each other throughout the day through the halls of Congress, whacking each other with hickory sticks and fire tongs, okay? Get into little altercations, and other congressmen were having to rip them apart because this was getting so out of hand. We also need to understand that despite there being violence on the floor of Congress, again, this was just kind of like, hey, you guys stop it. There was votes to not remove them from Congress. They just kind of had to apologize and let bygones be bygones. And there were no charges brought against either of them as a result of this physical altercation on the floor of Congress. Okay. But then a little later down the road, Matthew Lyon, who was also a journalist, we need to understand, wrote some newspaper articles criticizing the Federalist Party and criticizing President Adams' policies. And that's what got him arrested, okay? Not getting in a fight on the floor of Congress, not spitting on another congressman. What charges came against him were simply practicing his right to free press and his right to free speech by criticizing the president through writing. And Matthew Lyon was appalled by this, okay? And he ran for re-election from jail and was successful, right? He's the only congressman to date to be elected from jail. So if people in the United States were willing to re-elect this congressman from jail who had been jailed as a result of the Sedition Acts, what does this demonstrate about public sentiment towards these acts? Are they very favorable for them if they're willing to re-elect a congressman who's sitting in jail as a result of them? No, right? This demonstrates that there's strong public opposition to the Alien and Sedition Acts. Another clear example of opposition to the Alien and Sedition Acts example of, hey, you might want to underline that, was the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. So these were some resolutions written by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. They argued against the Alien Sedition Acts and declared that they were unconstitutional. They took this argument a step further and they suggested that states could legally nullify, meaning refuse to follow any federal law that they found unconstitutional. All right, so they're basically saying here, not only do the states not have to follow this law, but as a standard principle, states do not have to follow any laws that they believe are unconstitutional. The reason for this is, their argument is that the federal government under the Constitution got its power from the states. All right, their suggestion was that because the states ratified the Constitution, and that's what really put it into effect, that all federal power really came from the states. It's a bit of an overstatement. We know that we have a federalist system where power is shared between the central government and the states, but this was their argument. So they started also in these resolutions calling on the public to come vote for Democratic Republicans because they wanted to replace these Federalists as quickly as possible to overturn the Alien and Sedition Acts because they believed they were unconstitutional. And in the meantime, they're saying, do not abide by these laws. They're unconstitutional. We can nullify them, meaning we do not have to follow them. So once again, this is a clear example of opposition to the acts, but it's also an example of early arguments of states' rights over federal power. Okay, and this kind of argument would continue to be looked back to moving forward when people started considering things like secession. Okay, now I'm not saying in this case Thomas Jefferson and James Madison were by no means pushing for secession or anything along those lines, but they are really making strong arguments of states' rights and states having more power than the federal government, and the federal government being kind of subject to doing what the states want, and the states being able to make decisions for themselves, that the federal government is not abiding by what they want. Those same kinds of arguments would be made by people later down the road who are going to advocate things like secession. Okay, and they will look back to the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions as a basis for that. So in short, this is going to lead to future disagreements between state and federal governments. All right, but Adams was voted out of office in the presidential election of 1800. Jefferson had won the popular vote here. Adams clearly was lower than Jefferson in terms of the popular vote, but the popular vote, of course, is not what determines who becomes president. It's the electoral vote in the Electoral College. In the Electoral College, there was an equal number of votes between Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, both of whom were Democratic Republicans. So this is the first tied election in U.S. history. And again, we need to understand history is not inevitable. The system could have very easily failed here. But the federal government here looked to the processes set forth in the U.S. Constitution. They said, okay, we created a strategy for what to do in this situation. And while other nations in other parts of history, when they come to these kinds of situations, would say, okay, well, if it's being disputed whether or not I'm at power, I'm going to assert my power through military force, and you are all going to abide by my rule and accept it for what it is. But instead of doing that, these two guys agreed to abide by the process set forward in the U.S. Constitution, which was to take this to the House of Representatives and allow them to have a special election to decide who the candidate would be. Now, Alexander Hamilton had a pretty influential voice in the House of Representatives, okay, and he had a lot of sway over who they would select to become this new president. And he persuaded everybody that, you know, Jefferson is not my favorite guy in the world. He's the leader of my rival political party, but he perhaps has some pretensions of being a good man, meaning he has a slightest bit of potential that we might be able to get something good out of him if we work with him. Aaron Burr, by contrast, is dirt, okay? He is the scum of the earth. We cannot by any means allow him to become president. So I can't tell you what to do, but I really think it would be in all of our best interest if you decide to vote for Thomas Jefferson, okay? And he convinced majority of the members of the House to vote for Thomas Jefferson. So, for example, he said Mr. Burr is the most unfit man in the United States for the presidency. And he played a very key role in convincing the members of the House to elect Thomas Jefferson as the president of this election of 1800. This would have some long-term impacts on Hamilton and Burr. Okay, this would lead to long-term resentment between them. And as a result of this resentment, Burr really came to dislike Hamilton, and he challenged him to a duel. Now we need to understand that duels already were seen as questionable in this time. Some states had already started to make dueling illegal, but these guys were able to find a place where they could duel. And they met up there. And the way that duels normally worked, it wasn't this big honorable thing where people walked 12 paces away and the best gunslinger fired before the other one could see or whatever, anything like that. This was usually two guys who would show up and they'd kind of shoot at the ground or shoot in the air and try to demonstrate to each other, I'm not scared of you. I'm such a badass that I showed up to this duel. And that was kind of a sense of honor. And then their opponent would usually kind of just give them an ugly nod and they'd both walk off. And then they'd kind of dignify each other's bravery for showing up to this duel. And that would be that. Okay. So it was more of a demonstration of badassery than an actual trying to kill one another. Okay. Kind of a display of power in a way. So think about it like in high school when you'd see two big guys get in the hallway and they'd start kind of shoving each other a little bit, getting each other's faces. But then a lot of times they wouldn't actually swing. They'd be like, yo, what we doing? We cool? And they like maybe shake hands or something and they wouldn't actually fight. Okay, that's basically how most duels went down. And that's what Hamilton came into this expecting, okay? He thought this was going to be a gentleman's duel. And he fired, as we see here in the picture, he's firing into the air. So clearly he had no intentions of actually shooting Aaron Burr. But Aaron Burr went straight for the kill, all right? He aimed straight at Hamilton, fired, and ended up killing Hamilton. So that was it for Alexander Hamilton, okay? This very influential statesman in the United States was killed as a result of this election of 1800. This is a pretty significant election in very many ways. All right, we can see that it was the first successful tie-breaking election in U.S. history. It was also the first successful transfer of power between political parties, and this remained peaceful. Again, this is not inevitable by any means. We've seen several examples throughout history where there's tied elections like this in early nations, and one of the disputed candidates will kind of have a coup or have a military uprising and say, I am in charge and nobody's going to challenge me. That didn't happen here, okay? People use the peaceful political process that have been put in place, which also demonstrated that this new republic could prevail through political disagreements. Okay, it kind of showed we can have people with different opinions, different political parties even, and manage to make this process function. As long as they don't sit there disputing the results and having insurrections and, okay, getting a little carried away there. So this definitely also demonstrates the republic can prevail through political disagreements. Not to say that it always does. None of this, guys, is inevitable. And that's the beauty of this. Okay, we can understand that history is not just a story of the valiant U.S. growing into the great nation that it was destined to become. And we see that there's so many steps along the way where the U.S. could have easily failed and we managed to prevail. That makes history so much more beautiful. Okay. All right. But on his way out the door, President Adams was going to make one last attempt to maintain power for the Federalists, okay? So remember, he's being voted out of office. The Democratic Republicans are going to take office. But he did a little something to try to preserve Federalist power within the federal government, okay? He helped pass, in the final days of his presidency, what was known as the Judiciary Act. So this grew the federal court system and enabled him to appoint more federal judges. So there's now new vacancies that he needed to fill for federal judges. So his plan was to pack as many Federalist judges into office as he could at the last minute. These were called his midnight appointments, up until the final moments of his presidency, up until midnight of the last day of his presidency. That's probably a bit of an exaggeration, but up until the last minute of his presidency, the argument is he's appointing Federalist judges into office to help maintain a sense of Federalist influence in the federal government, despite having to leave office and let the Democratic Republicans in. This all led pretty directly to the case of Marbury versus Madison. Marbury versus Madison was part of a bigger problem in which some of the midnight appointments did not get notified of their appointments to the court by the time Jefferson took office. So basically what happened is when Jefferson came into office, he found this big stack of papers on Adams's old desk, and he realized that those were basically documents showing who he was going to appoint as federal judges. Instead of doing the ethical thing and sending those papers along to the people who Adams was going to appoint, Jefferson kind of crumpled those up and filed them in his favorite filing cabinet, the trash can. And these appointments never got across to some of the judges who were supposed to be appointed to office. One such judge was a guy named William Marbury. And somehow or another, word got around to William Marbury that he was supposed to be appointed to a position in the federal courts, and that Jefferson had failed to give him that appointment. So Marbury sued Jefferson. He sued his Secretary of State more directly, James Madison, who should have been the one to issue this appointment. So this is where we get the case of Marbury versus Madison. So the Justice of the Supreme Court, John Marshall, told Marbury, look, dude, we understand that you kind of been screwed here. I think we can all agree on that. Problem is, the law in which Adams was going to appoint you a midnight judge, that Judiciary Act, we've got to determine that that law is unconstitutional. Okay, and I know you guys are probably thinking, dude, who cares? What do we care if this guy became a judge or not? I really don't care that you know that. What I want us to understand is that there's a bigger picture at play here, okay? This led to the Supreme Court understandingly having this right of judicial review. Judicial review refers to the Supreme Court's ability to determine whether a law is constitutional. And this is kind of what's assumed that the Supreme Court does now. This is kind of when people think of the Supreme Court, they say, okay, yeah, it interprets whether something's constitutional. It does some other things as well. But that's one of its major purposes, is to declare whether a law is constitutional. And this is the first time that they really exerted that power, okay? And this led to that recognition of judicial review as a power that the Supreme Court had moving forward. All right, I think we've seen enough of this fiasco of the Federalist Party here under the Adams administration. It's been a big mess, right? We've had violations of the First Amendment. We've had people protesting those and arguing that, hey, maybe the states don't even have to follow federal laws if we don't want to. We've had congressmen fighting on the floor of Congress. We've had a congressman reelected from jail. It is a big mess. Will things be any better under the Democratic Republican Party now that Thomas Jefferson's in office? Find out next time on History 1301. All right, guys, that's it for now. You got any questions? You know who your guy is and you know what to do. Otherwise, over and out.